The storm outside the saloon had raged for hours, beating against the thin wooden walls like a desperate animal trying to claw its way in. But inside, the noise was even worse: boots stomping, bottles shattering, drunken voices rising in arguments that could turn into shootings without warning. Amina ducked away from the swinging fist of a miner who didn't even notice she existed and slipped into the narrow hallway leading to the bathroom. Her hands shook as she pushed the door shut behind her. The room was barely larger than a closet, with a cracked mirror and a single lantern that flickered as if afraid of the darkness surrounding it. Amina leaned her back against the door and took a trembling breath, pressing a hand over her pounding chest. Tonight was supposed to be the night she escaped. For months she'd carried the plan in her heart like a fragile secret. She had saved every spare coin she could find, sweeping the saloon floors, laundering strangers' clothing, fetching drinks for men who never cared to look at her face. She'd slipped money beneath loose floorboards, hiding them where the saloon owner, Bryce Tanner, couldn't find them. She endured long nights, insults, and hands that strayed too close just to gather enough to flee. And tonight, she finally had enough. But the fight that broke out moments ago changed everything. She'd been walking toward the back door when two cowboys lunged at each other, tossing chairs aside, sending tables crashing. The commotion drew everyone's eyes. Amina knew she couldn't risk being seen slipping away, not with a Bryce close enough to grab her by the hair the moment he sensed her plan. So she ran to the only place she could hide. Now she stood in the bathroom, breathing hard, her satchel of carefully saved coins pressed against her chest. The mirror reflected her anxiety. Her brown skin glistened with sweat, her braids loosely tied back, her eyes wide with terror and hope. She whispered, "Just a few minutes. Let it quiet down. Just a few minutes and I'm free." A loud crash outside made her jump. Voices erupted, angry, slurred, dangerous. Someone shouted for Bryce. Another yelled about a stolen horse. Amina stiffened. She pressed her ear against the door. Then, footsteps. Heavy ones, coming straight toward her. Her breath froze. If Bryce found her hiding, he'd drag her out in front of everyone. He'd break her escape money apart coin by coin. He'd lock her upstairs for weeks. She clutched the doorknob, debating if she should flee through the tiny window instead, but it was too narrow, too high. The footsteps stopped, right outside the door. Amina closed her eyes and whispered a prayer. The doorknob turned. The bathroom door swung open just a crack, then all the way. A man stepped inside. Not Bryce, not any miner or cowboy she had seen before. He was tall, towering, broad-shouldered, with long raven-black hair tied behind him. His clothes were travel-worn buckskin, and blood dripped from his knuckles. His dark eyes landed on her instantly, sharp as a blade yet calm as a still lake. An Apache warrior. Amina pressed back against the wall, breath trapped in her throat. She had heard stories of Apache fighters, fearless, swift, silent. But she'd never seen one up close. He had the presence of a man used to storms, but unaffected by them. He shut the door behind him with slow, deliberate quiet. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, the small bathroom feeling even smaller. Then he spoke, his voice deep, steady, carrying a strange gentleness she did not expect. "I saw you trying to escape," he murmured. Amina's heart lurched. I wasn't. You were," he interrupted softly, not unkindly. "And the man who owns this place, he won't let you." His gaze dipped to her trembling hands. "You fear him." Amina swallowed. "Everyone fears him, not me." Something in the way he said it, unshaken, certain, made her breath catch. He stepped closer, not threatening, but aware of every sound outside. "You don't have long," he said. "They're searching for me. And soon they'll search for you." "Me?" she whispered. He nodded once. I can help you leave this place, if you trust me." Amina stared at him, this stranger who seemed carved from earth and fire, and in her chest hope flickered like the lantern flame. The night wasn't over, and neither was her chance at freedom. The first thing Amina noticed was the way he moved, silent but deliberate, each step measured as if the floor itself feared his weight. Coda, the Apache's name, he would later tell her, did not raise his voice, did not threaten. He simply stood there, calm, observing her like someone trying to read a fragile map. She had never felt so exposed and yet, strangely, so safe. "Sit," he said finally, motioning to a cracked wooden chair in the corner. His voice was low but carried a firmness that brooked no argument. Amina obeyed, feeling her legs shake as she lowered herself onto the chair. She clutched the satchel of coins in her lap like a lifeline. Coda crouched slightly to examine his own wounded hand, a deep cut across the knuckles, dried blood caking along the edges. "Fought in the street?" she asked softly, unsure why she felt compelled to speak. "Caught in a tangle," he replied, eyes never leaving hers. "They wanted my horse, and instead they found you." His tone held no malice, only a quiet understanding, as though he could see the fear and exhaustion etched into her very bones. Amina swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. I've been trapped here." "For months," she admitted. The words came faster than she expected, spilling out of her mouth in a tremor of fear and hope. "I've worked every day, scraped together every coin, and still, I'm not free. I was supposed to leave tonight, but—" Her voice broke, and she pressed a hand over her mouth. Coda's gaze softened, though his posture remained strong, unwavering. "You've carried this alone for far too long," he said. "And yet, here you are, still planning, still surviving." Amina's chest tightened. Few people, no one in her life had ever spoken to her like that. She had been treated as property, as a tool, as someone whose voice was irrelevant. Yet this stranger, this Apache warrior, saw her in a way no one else ever had. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't even know me." Coda looked down at his hand, flexing the injured fingers slowly. "Because I see your spirit," he said finally. "Because it reminds me of someone I lost. Someone who had fire, who refused to bow even when the world tried to break her. You remind me of her." His dark eyes met hers, steady, unwavering. "And you deserve freedom. Not just survival." For the first time in what felt like forever, Amina allowed herself to believe him, to imagine a life beyond the saloon, beyond fear. Yet doubt still clung to her like a shadow. "What if I fail?" she whispered. "What if he catches me?" Coda's jaw tightened. "Then I will carry you past him." There was no boast in his words, only certainty. "No one will stop me from ensuring you leave this place alive." Amina's throat went dry. His presence was overwhelming, an unspoken promise, a shield of strength she could lean on. She had dreamed of escape for months, but now that a man stood beside her, ready to risk his own life, it no longer felt like a dream. It felt terrifyingly real. The sounds of the saloon, the shouts, the crashes, the roaring of men suddenly felt distant. In that cramped bathroom, time seemed suspended. Amina noticed every detail, the faint leather scent of his clothing, the slow rise and fall of his chest, the quiet resolve in his eyes. "Listen," Coda said, breaking the silence, "I will not let anyone take you back there. But you must be ready. When I say go, you run. Not for me, not for anyone, but for yourself. You are stronger than you think." Amina nodded, though she doubted she fully understood her own courage. But in that moment, with Coda watching over her, she felt a spark of hope ignite. The fear that had shackled her for months, the fear of the man who owned her, the fear of the world outside began to ebb. replaced by a fragile, trembling determination, and as Coda rose, moving to check the door once more, she realized she was no longer hiding alone. Someone else had entered her storm, someone who would stand by her, even in the chaos of a saloon that wanted to consume her. For the first time, Amina believed she might survive the night, and perhaps, if she was brave enough, claim a life she had never dared to imagine. The quiet in the bathroom lasted only a heartbeat before it was shattered by the roar of Bryce Tanner's voice. "Amina, where are you? I know you're hiding." The sound of his boots pounding the wooden floor echoed through the saloon walls, shaking the thin bathroom door. Amina's heart thumped violently against her chest. She pressed herself against the wall, clutching the satchel of coins as if it were a talisman against the man's rage. Coda moved in front of her instinctively, broad shoulders blocking the small space between her and the door. Even in the dim flicker of the lantern, he looked like an immovable wall, solid as stone and just as unyielding. "You shouldn't have come here," he muttered under his breath, more to himself than to her. But Amina understood. It wasn't a warning, it was a promise. Outside, Bryce's voice rose, slurred with drink and fury. "You can't hide forever, girl. You belong to me." Amina's stomach dropped. "I don't belong to anyone," she whispered, barely audibly. Coda's eyes snapped to hers. "Not to anyone," he repeated, his voice low, carrying authority and steel. She felt a shiver run down her spine. There was no doubt in his words, no hesitation. In that moment, he became more than a protector. He became a force she could rely on, a living shield against a world that had tried to own her. Bryce rattled the doorknob with increasing violence. The wood groaned under his assault. "I said." He was cut off as Coda stepped closer. Hands ready, muscles coiled like a predator. "Open it, and you will regret it," Coda said softly, but every syllable carried the weight of a man capable of incredible violence. The drunken saloon owner hesitated. His hand froze on the doorknob, a flash of uncertainty crossing his face. He had fought men before. He had taken what he wanted from women before, but never had anyone confronted him like this. Never had anyone spoken with a calm certainty that promised ruin if ignored. Amina realized, with a mixture of fear and awe, that Coda was not bluffing. This stranger, this warrior, would kill without hesitation if he had to. And he had already claimed her protection. "Let her go, Bryce," Coda said, voice low, dangerous. "You have no claim here." Bryce's face contorted with fury. "And who are you? Some damned Indian coming to tell me how to run my saloon?" Coda didn't flinch. "I am the man who will ensure she leaves this place alive," he said, eyes locked on Bryce's. "Do not test me." The threat hung in the air, invisible but palpable. Bryce's bravado faltered as he realized the depth of the danger standing between him and his prize. Sweat gleamed on his forehead, and his lips trembled with a mix of anger and fear. Amina felt a strange surge of courage swell inside her. For the first time, she wasn't hiding. She wasn't powerless. She wasn't alone. She could see clearly that the man in front of her, the Apache warrior, was willing to do what no one else could, protect her. Not as property, not as a tool, but as a human being with a right to freedom. Bryce finally let out a frustrated roar, banging the door one last time before stepping back. His shouts echoed into the hallway, blending with the chaos of the saloon. Coda kept his stance, his dark eyes still on the door, waiting for any sign of threat. He finally turned to Amina, his expression softening just enough to make her knees weaken. "You are safe for now," he said, voice quieter, gentler. "But we must leave. They will come for you again." Amina nodded, barely trusting herself to speak. Her mind was a whirlwind of fear, relief, and a strange, fluttering hope. She had never known a man who saw her in this way, who understood her pain and yet refused to judge, who offered her the chance to fight for her life rather than simply telling her to obey. Coda's presence filled the tiny bathroom, and for the first time in months, she felt the possibility of escape not just from the saloon, but from the life that had held her captive. And as she prepared to follow him into the shadows, she knew one thing. The world outside might be dangerous, but with Coda at her side, she might finally claim the freedom she had always dreamed of. The bathroom was no longer a prison, it had become a sanctuary, however small and fleeting. The shouts from the saloon still echoed faintly through the wooden walls, but inside, there was only the sound of their breathing and the subtle creak of floorboards beneath Coda's careful movements. Amina's chest heaved as she tried to steady herself. Her hand still clutched the satchel of coins, but now it felt less like a lifeline and more like a relic of a life she was leaving behind. Coda knelt slightly to examine the wound on his hand again, his eyes briefly meeting hers, dark and intense. There was a strange gravity in his gaze, a depth that made her forget everything else, the noise, the danger, the past months of fear. "You've been through a lot," Coda murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. It was a statement, not a question. Amina felt the weight of his words settle over her, filling the tiny space between them with an honesty she wasn't used to. No one had ever acknowledged her suffering, her resilience, in such a quiet, deliberate way. I don't even know how to explain it," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I've been trapped, forced to work, afraid to speak, afraid to move, afraid to hope." Her fingers brushed the lantern's flame, and the light flickered across her face, highlighting the weariness in her eyes, the stubborn defiance she tried so hard to hide. Coda leaned closer, but not threateningly. There was no pressure, no expectation, only a presence that made her pulse race in ways she didn't fully understand. "You survived," he said simply, "and that makes you stronger than most." Amina swallowed, her throat dry. She could feel the closeness between them, the heat radiating from his body, the subtle scent of leather and smoke that clung to his clothes. Her heart raced not from fear alone, but from the undeniable pull she felt toward him. In the midst of chaos, he was calm, unshakable, and in that calm, she found something she hadn't known she was searching for: safety. Not just from the saloon, but from the world that had beaten her down for so long. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the silence filled with unspoken thoughts. Amina noticed the way his jaw clenched slightly, the tension in his shoulders, the way his dark eyes softened when they met hers. She realized that he was not only a warrior but a man who carried his own burdens, a man who had seen loss, pain, and hardship, but had not allowed it to harden his heart completely. Her fingers itched to reach out, to touch him, to feel some connection beyond words. And when she did, brushing her hand lightly against his, he didn't pull away. Instead, he placed his hand over hers, warm and firm, grounding her in the moment. The simple touch sent a shiver through her, a current that startled and thrilled her at once. "You are worth more than fear," he said quietly, his lips barely moving. The words were not a command, not a plea, but a truth he wanted her to understand. "And tonight, no one can take that from you." Amina's lips parted, unsure what to say, unsure how to respond to a man who seemed to see her entirely, who recognized her strength and fragility at the same time. The room felt smaller, the world beyond the walls shrinking to nothing. She could feel her own pulse, loud and insistent, matching his. Then, without warning, the tension shifted. Their faces were inches apart, breaths mingling, the flickering lantern casting shadows that danced across their features. Amina's hands trembled as she realized how close they had come, not just physically, but emotionally. Trust, fear, desire, and hope coalesced in a way that left her dizzy. Koda's hand tightened slightly over hers, his forehead leaning toward hers, and she felt the unmistakable weight of a promise in that simple motion. Not a promise of possession or demand, but of protection, of respect, of a connection forged in the most impossible of circumstances. For a moment, the chaos of the saloon, the danger waiting outside, and the life she had known all faded. All that existed was this moment, this small room, this stranger who had become her shield and her anchor. Amina realized, with a mixture of awe and fear, that something had changed between them. A spark had been lit, a fragile, dangerous, and irresistible spark. And in that tiny bathroom, amid the shadows and the uncertainty, she understood something she had never allowed herself to hope. She might not only survive the night, she might just find a future worth fighting for, with him by her side. The small bathroom felt impossibly tight as Koda straightened from his crouch, his dark eyes locking on Amina's. Despite the confined space and the distant chaos outside, a new quiet had settled between them, a fragile kind of intimacy that neither had expected. Her heartbeat, racing moments ago in fear, now raced for entirely different reasons. "You are brave," Koda said softly, his voice carrying a weight that seemed far older than his years. "And you are clever. You've survived this place longer than most could. That's strength. It is remarkable." Amina's lips parted slightly. Compliments were not new to her, but the tone in his voice was different, earnest, without pretense, without hidden agendas. She found herself wondering what he saw when he looked at her, beyond the bruises and exhaustion. She had spent so long hiding pieces of herself, she wasn't sure she could ever be entirely visible. Yet here he was, seeing her entirely, without judgment. I didn't know anyone could see me like that," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "All my life, I've been invisible, or worse, a thing to be used." Koda's hand moved toward hers, hovering but not yet touching. "In my people's ways," he said slowly, deliberately, "a warrior protects the woman he chooses. Not because she belongs to him, but because she deserves a life free of harm. You have been denied that life for too long, and now you will not face it alone." Amina felt a shiver run down her spine. His words were not just comforting. They carried a promise, a declaration of intent that left her breathless. "Choose me?" she whispered, barely daring to speak. "Yes," he replied. His voice was firm, steady, and there was no room for argument. "I did not come looking for a partner. I came for other matters. But fate placed you in my path. And in my heart, I know you deserve more than survival. You deserve a future." Her throat tightened. She had spent so long imagining freedom, yet never had she imagined it could come from someone like him, not just a protector, but a man willing to stake his life on her right to choose. "But I am nothing," she murmured, doubt creeping into her tone. "I am just a servant, a woman no one would care for." Koda stepped closer, his presence overwhelming yet grounding. "You are not nothing," he said, almost sharply, though his eyes softened. "You are everything. Your courage, your spirit, your heart, they are worth more than this town, more than any man who thinks he can claim you. And I will honor that, always." Amina could feel her pulse quicken as he spoke, her own voice catching in her throat. In that moment, she realized this was no ordinary promise. This was a vow, a declaration born not from desire alone, but from deep respect, from a cultural code that demanded loyalty and protection. He did not see her as property. He saw her as a partner, as someone whose life mattered beyond measure. I don't know if I can trust this," she admitted. Fear and hope warred inside her. The room was filled with unspoken tension, the kind that made the air itself feel electric. "I've been betrayed so many times." Koda's hand finally brushed hers, warm and firm. The contact was simple, yet it sent an undeniable current through her. "Then let me show you," he said quietly. "Let me carry you past this fear. Not just tonight, but always. You have the choice, Amina, and I will not force it. I will only offer it. That is my vow." Her breath caught at the gravity of his words. A vow in his culture was not empty. It was binding, a commitment forged by honor, courage, and integrity. And for the first time, Amina felt the possibility of a life that could truly be hers, one where she was seen, respected, and protected. I want that," she whispered, a tear escaping down her cheek. Not because she was weak, but because she was finally allowing herself to believe in something she had long thought impossible: safety, freedom, and perhaps even love. Koda's gaze softened, and a small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at his lips. "Then we leave together," he said. "And nothing, no man, no town, no fear will take that from you." The promise hung in the air, unbroken and unwavering. In that tiny bathroom, amid the chaos and uncertainty, a bond had been forged, one that would define the nights ahead, the dangers to come, and the uncharted path of their lives together. Amina realized, with a trembling mix of awe and relief, that she was no longer alone. For the first time, someone had chosen her not for what she could give, but for who she was. And in that choice, she felt the first taste of freedom she had ever truly known. The lantern flickered, casting long shadows against the cracked walls of the bathroom. Outside, the shouts and commotion from the saloon had begun to fade, replaced by the distant clatter of boots and the occasional crash of overturned furniture. Inside, however, the tension between Amina and Koda was thick, almost tangible. Like a storm held at bay by a single breath, Amina's heart still pounded from the adrenaline of the escape plan. Yet it was no longer fear driving it. Instead, it was something deeper, more intimate, a growing awareness of the man who had risked everything to protect her. He had saved her, yes, but he had also seen her in a way no one else ever had. And that recognition sent a thrill through her she could barely understand. Koda stepped closer, his presence commanding yet gentle. Every movement he made seemed deliberate, controlled, as if he were aware that the smallest gesture could shift the fragile balance between safety and something far more personal. "You trust me," he said quietly, his dark eyes searching hers. There was no accusation in the words, only certainty, a quiet truth. "I do," Amina whispered, though her voice shook slightly. She wasn't sure if it was the fear, the thrill, or something else entirely that made her pulse race. He nodded slowly, absorbing her words. Then, after a long pause, he stepped even closer, close enough that their shoulders brushed, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. His eyes softened, but the intensity in them deepened, a fierceness that spoke of both desire and promise. "Amina?" he murmured, his voice low, almost a growl. "I do not ask lightly. I do not demand. But I must speak my truth." He hesitated, then took a breath that seemed to carry the weight of his entire life. "Tonight, I want you to carry my heir." The words struck her like a physical blow. Her eyes widened, and she stumbled backward slightly, though he caught her before she fell. The room seemed to shrink, the flickering light catching on his sharp features, emphasizing the gravity of what he had just said. "You?" "What?" she whispered, disbelief mingling with shock. "I want a child with you," Koda said firmly, yet tenderly. "Not as a possession, not as a claim, but as a life we build together. A future that is ours alone, far from this place, far from those who would see you broken or sold. I ask this because I see in you strength, courage, and a spirit I cannot ignore. I want our lives bound not by fear, but by choice, by trust, and by blood, if your heart allows it." Amina's mind raced. She had never imagined such words, such an intimate request, especially from a man she barely knew yet trusted completely. Her heart swelled with conflicting emotions, fear, desire, awe, and a strange, trembling hope. She wanted to say yes, but the enormity of the vow made her hesitate. She started, her voice faltering. "I don't know if I can." Coda lifted her chin gently, his thumb brushing her cheek. His touch was soft, grounding, a stark contrast to the fierceness in his eyes. "You may not know," he said quietly. "I do not expect you to. But know this, it is not a demand. It is a choice. And if you accept, I will honor it with my life. I will protect you. I will cherish you, always." Her breath hitched. The warmth of his words, the sincerity in his gaze, the weight of his promise, all of it combined to create a moment so charged, so intimate, that the world outside the bathroom ceased to exist. The lantern's flame flickered across his strong features, and she realized that the man before her was not just a warrior. He was someone who could love fiercely, protect relentlessly, and trust wholly. Amina swallowed hard, feeling a tear slide down her cheek. I want that," she whispered finally, her voice trembling. "If you will have me, if we can leave this world behind." Coda's expression softened, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Then we leave together," he said. "And nothing, no man, no town, no fear will ever take that from us." In that small, dimly lit bathroom, amid shadows and uncertainty, a vow was forged, one that would define their lives, their future, and the destiny of the child they would someday raise together. Amina realized with a mix of awe and trembling excitement that she had not only found safety, she had found a life worth daring for and a man willing to walk beside her into it. The lantern in the bathroom flickered one last time before Coda extinguished it, plunging the room into near darkness. Outside, the saloon had descended into chaos. Bryce Tanner and his drunken cohort were still searching, shouting Amina's name and threatening anyone in their path. But Coda's senses were sharp. He had been tracking danger far longer than she had known fear. "Stay close," he whispered, pressing a hand to the small of her back as he led her to the back door. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of wet earth and distant sagebrush. Amina's heart thudded not only from adrenaline, but from the sheer intensity of the moment, the thrill of freedom mingling with the ache of leaving everything familiar behind. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Somewhere they cannot find us," Coda replied. "But you must be ready to run, always. Trust only me." They slipped out of the back door, stepping into a narrow alley that ran along the side of the saloon. Broken crates and barrels offered fleeting cover, shadows forming natural shields from the torches and lanterns that bobbed in the distance. Bryce's curses echoed behind them. Amina gripped Coda's arm instinctively, leaning against him for balance, feeling the strength in his shoulder and the steady rhythm of his stride. "Keep moving," he murmured, sensing her hesitation. "We are not safe until we are far from this town." The alley opened onto a dirt street, slick from recent rain. Coda glanced around, scanning for threats, before reaching a small stable tucked between two buildings. A horse, a sturdy mare with dark brown fur, was waiting, saddled and ready. "Quickly," he urged, guiding Amina toward it. With his help, she swung onto the horse's back, heart racing. Coda mounted beside her, his presence solid and protective. The mare shied at a distant shout, but Coda's steady hand calmed her. "Hold on tight," he instructed. Amina did, gripping him instinctively as the horse bolted down the empty street. Gunshots rang out behind them, echoing in the night. Bryce and his men were not far behind. Amina clutched the satchel of coins to her chest and buried her face against Koda's shoulder, adrenaline and fear blending with a strange, exhilarating trust. He did not speak, only guided the horse expertly, weaving through narrow streets and alleys, using the shadows to their advantage. The town began to blur behind them as they reached the outskirts. The buildings gave way to scrubland and open desert. The wind whipped past Amina's face, cool and cleansing. For the first time in months, she could breathe not the shallow, cautious breaths of a prisoner, but deep, free ones. Tasting the night air as if it belonged to her, Koda urged the horse faster, the desert stretching endlessly before them. "We are not safe yet," he reminded her, though his voice held a note of reassurance. "Keep moving. Trust me." Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes. Amina couldn't tell. The desert was a maze of shadows and moonlight, and Koda's knowledge of the terrain was unmatched. He guided her over rocky outcrops, across shallow washes, and past hidden gullies, never once letting the mare stumble. Every step, every cautious turn, was a dance of survival. Finally, as dawn's first light tinged the horizon with pale gold, Koda slowed the horse. They had reached a secluded canyon, the perfect hiding place far from the prying eyes of Brace and his men. Amina slid from the horse, legs weak but heart soaring. The desert stretched around them, wild and untamed, but for the first time, it felt like freedom. Koda dismounted beside her, his hand steadying her as she caught her breath. "We are safe for now," he said. His dark eyes softened as they met hers. "This is just the beginning. But together, we will survive. Together, we will make a life beyond their reach." Amina's chest rose and fell rapidly, her fear giving way to relief, awe, and an unfamiliar thrill of possibility. She realized she had not only escaped the saloon but had entered a world where she could make choices, where Koda's strength was her shield, and her courage was her compass. And as the sun rose over the jagged desert cliffs, she knew this flight through the night had done more than save her life. It had begun a new chapter, one filled with danger, yes, but also with hope, trust, and a bond forged in fire and shadow. The journey ahead would be long, and the world beyond this canyon would test them both. But for the first time, Amina felt something she had never dared to hope. She was no longer alone. The canyon's shadows receded as the sun rose higher, painting the desert in golden hues. For the first time since she had hidden in that cramped saloon bathroom, Amina allowed herself to truly breathe. Dust clung to her hair and clothes, her legs were sore from hours on horseback, and her chest still heaved with adrenaline, but there was something else, hope. Koda led her through a narrow pass, his movements confident and deliberate. The world beyond the town felt vast, dangerous, and wild, yet strangely alive, as if the desert itself had been waiting to welcome them. Amina followed, her hand brushing the leather of his coat instinctively. The closeness between them was not merely physical, it was the unspoken bond of two people who had faced danger together, who had chosen trust over fear. Finally, as the canyon opened into a hidden valley, Amina saw it, the Apache camp. Simple dwellings clustered together, smoke rising from cooking fires, children laughing in the distance, and warriors moving with a quiet strength that spoke of centuries of survival. It was a place untouched by the greed and cruelty of the white towns. Amina felt a strange stirring in her chest, safety, belonging, and possibility. Koda guided her to the camp's edge, where elders and women paused to study the newcomers. Amina felt a wave of anxiety. She was a stranger, a woman from outside their world, and her presence would surely raise questions. Yet Koda's hand tightened over hers, steadying her, and she felt her courage return. "This is your choice," Koda whispered. "You may stay or leave, but if you stay, you will not be alone. Not ever." Amina looked up at him, eyes wide, emotions swirling. I want to stay, she said softly, her voice trembling. I choose to be here with you. The elders studied her silently. Then Coda stepped forward, his posture commanding yet respectful. This woman is my intended, he declared. She is under my protection, and her life and choice are sacred. She has left the world behind to join ours. Let her be welcomed. A silence hung in the air for a moment before nods of acceptance spread through the camp. Amina felt the tension drain from her shoulders, replaced by a warmth she had never known. They did not just accept her, they acknowledged her courage, and the bond she shared with Coda. He led her to a small dwelling at the edge of the camp, simple but sturdy, with blankets and mats waiting. Amina realized she had never imagined a place like this, not in her wildest dreams. The walls smelled of earth and smoke, of home. Coda set her satchel down and knelt to meet her eyes. "You have been through so much," he said, voice soft, almost reverent. "And yet, here you are. You survived. You chose life, and now, this is ours to build. A family, a future, a life free of fear." Amina's eyes welled with tears, but they were not tears of sorrow, they were tears of relief, awe, and burgeoning love. "I never thought I could belong anywhere," she whispered. "But with you, I feel like I might." Coda reached for her hand, lifting it to his lips in a gesture both protective and intimate. "You do belong," he said firmly. "Not to a town, not to a man, not to fear. You belong to yourself, and to the life we will build together." As the sun rose higher over the desert cliffs, the camp came alive around them. Children ran past, laughter echoing off the canyon walls. The wind carried the scent of sage and smoke, of earth and life. Amina felt a surge of gratitude, of awe at the wild, beautiful world that had opened up before her. For the first time, she could imagine a future, a life where she was seen, cherished, and protected. A life where she could make choices, bear a family, and love freely. And with Coda by her side, she knew she had the strength and courage to embrace it all. He lifted her chin gently, their foreheads touching, and whispered, "Tonight was only the beginning. Tomorrow, and every day after, we will write our story together. A story no one can take from us." Amina smiled through her tears, resting her head against his chest. The danger of the past night had faded, replaced by the promise of a life that was hers to claim. The warrior who had saved her had become the man who would walk beside her forever. And together, they would face the world not as prey, not as fugitives, but as two souls who had chosen each other against all odds. And in the heart of the desert, amidst the Apache camp that would now be her home, Amina finally understood freedom, love, and a future worth fighting for were not just dreams. They were real. And they were hers.